Awesome, thank you so much. So hi everyone, welcome to SciComm's first event in Trust and Research Week, and which is our first kind of week which is dedicated to trust and research. We'll be having some excellent discussions um, on just the state of trust and the state of research and how those two topics kind of intermingle. And so this is our first event, conversations about trust and research. And my name is Sarah, and I'm SciComm's president, and we're really excited to have everyone here. And I'll be handing it off to Mickey now, who'll be kind of running the rest of the event.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to our two panelists for being here. We're very, very excited, and we've put together a couple of discussion questions, which I'll read out loud, and I'll also be posting in the chat for anyone who maybe didn't hear it and wants to be reminded of the prompt. So the first one is kind of starting from where we're at. SciComm is based around this idea of improving undergraduates' ability to explain science, to understand science, to engage more in science communication and research communication in general. And so what in our education, how does our education and how we're taught research, how we engage with it as undergraduates, how does that play a role, or even in high school situations, or the way that people learn about research or science, how does that play a role in the reception of research and science in the public? So whoever would like to start with that.
Well, I'm happy to jump in and say thanks very much for having me, and hello to my colleague, Dr. Levine, who I'm very happy to see on a Sunday afternoon and be in conversation with. So, oftentimes when, so it's important to say that I'm a historian and a humanist, and it's an important distinction, which is to say that little of the work that I do is framed or premised or emanates out of something that we might term the scientific method. So perhaps I'll be able to convey, some sense about how humanists think about trust, though I'm still thinking that through myself today. I hope I'll be able to convey a sense of how we work. But I'm a historian, and when I meet undergraduate students, many of them for the first time taking a college level history course, what I often hear is, wow, this is so different from the way I was taught history in high school. That oftentimes I hear history was pretty dry and pretty dull, a lot of names and dates and facts, a lot of rote memorization. And when I hear that, I appreciate how different it is, I think, to be in a college classroom and to discover, maybe for the first time, or at least for the first time, to be fully immersed in the ways in which we not only practice history, but we think about it as a field of inquiry, or a field for the production of knowledge. One of the first, I think, light bulb moments is when students discover historiography, which is to say, we have an entire field devoted to the ways in which historians' ideas, historians' interpretations have changed over time. And so there's a first key to the ways in which historians think about learning and research, which is that we don't expect our ideas to be ironclad or unassailable or even replicable in some way, but instead we understand better knowledge, better understanding, better insight to be produced out of debate and through successive generations of historians whose interpretations shift as we discover new evidence, as we apply new theories, and as we respond to the real-time questions that are being asked of and about the past. We don't have the sense that history is a fixed or unassailable enterprise at all. And the biggest compliment to a historian is when a next generation finds their work valuable enough, impactful enough, that they come along to change it, overturn it, expand upon it in significant ways. So for students who think that, who come out of high school thinking that history is embodied in the facts and the dates, the people, it turns out that this new introduction to history as a highly interpretive field, and one that is driven by debates and generations and changing, expanding ideas, is probably the biggest challenge. And that's a challenge, I think, that even our PhD students confront as they have to think on two tracks. How do we explain the past? Yes, but how do we explain how for more than a century historians, it turns out, have not agreed at all about how to explain that past. They have to become experts in both.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'll go next, and also just first say, that I'm thrilled to be here, and I love that I'm part of an Agora Institute tag team with Dr. Jones. That's awesome, and I actually didn't know who the other panelists were going to be, and so it's like that's like such a awesome Sunday surprise. But then also I love the fact that sort of SciComm exists. And I'll just say, because I just joined the Johns Hopkins faculty in the middle of 2020. And so I'm just sort of like, so when I even got this invitation the other day, it was like, oh, wow, I didn't know this exists, but wow, it's pretty cool that it exists and stuff like that. And so I also, I will say, both over the course of this session, but then, afterwards, look forward to learning more about the organization and what your goals are and what your impact is on campus. And so, so this is like, I think this is a really great question, and I'm excited to sort of kind of engage with this as well as the other ones that we talked about a little bit in advance. And as I was sort of thinking about kind of how to respond to this, I wanted to focus first on the reception piece, I think like when I see that, like about sort of the reception of science, the first thing that really comes to mind is that you're talking about, to me at least, you're sort of talking about persuasion, who can persuade whom. And in general, sort of speaker credibility is really important when we're talking about persuasion. And I think that's something that people, like most people kind of know at some level. But the thing that's really interesting, that I think is really interesting about credibility, is that it's not something that's inherent to an individual because they happen to have like letters after their name, or they, certain degrees, or, whatever, but rather it's something that's granted by an audience. And so even like, everybody who's listening to me speak right now, like, might find me credible or might not. I mean, like, and it could be that I actually need to earn the credibility of the audience right now through the kinds of answers I give and considerations I raise and responses and so on. And so, so it's really an audience's perceptions of speaker credibility that matter, that get them to pay attention. And I think that that's sort of something, when we think about sort of reception of science, I mean, I do think there can be a tendency, and I'm going to speak in somewhat of a generality, to sort of say like, well, this person is a scientist, they study this, therefore we should be paying attention to them, or therefore you should be paying attention to them because you're not paying sufficient attention to them right now. And the thing is that exhorting people in that way, can feel good. There's no doubt that it can feel good. But if the goal is actually to get the people to pay attention and to be persuaded, they really, that's something they, as autonomous beings, they need to sort of grant that credibility. And so, so that's the first thing. So I think, is to really sort of, acknowledge that it is the perceptions of the audience, not the attributes of the speaker, that solely matter. And then, so it brings up the trust piece. And I think, so we think about sort of, like what are these perceptions of speaker credibility? There's really sort of two pieces of it. One is sort of this perception of competence, that the speaker knows what they're talking about, and the other is trustworthiness. And competence and trustworthiness are things that really matter, like, broadly. So they matter not only for sort of thinking about when are people likely to receive science or open to receiving science, but it's also the case that, like, they basically reflect sort of judgments we make about each other all the time, often unconsciously. And so judgments, for example, about one's ability, which is like a competence judgment, and judgments about one's intent, which would be a trustworthiness judgment, are judgments that we make all the time. And often, if we don't really have any other kind of information, they're made on a stereotypical basis. And so, but they tend to be sort of fairly unconscious. And so anyway, so that's sort of like, so that's like the first piece that kind of comes to mind when I sort of think about sort of how to unpack sort of reception of science and kind of like what do we need to know about sort of the potential receivers of this science, essentially, the kinds of perceptions that they might hold about the speaker. And then let's see. The other thing is, I think that the audience also sort of, reception also depends upon this kind of key, is going to also come more directly into thinking about education. Also needs to understand what's being said. And some of that is going to be a function of sort of how we sort of talk about these topics and the way in which, like, whether we're using whether scientists rather are using, certain speakers are using accessible language as they're talking about it. But some of it is also going to be a function of, like, their prior level of knowledge about the topic. And so, like, we are much more likely to sort of pay attention to something and also simply, like, commit it to long-term memory if it's sort of like is somehow connected to something that we already know about. There's basically sort of something that we've already thought about, something else, something we've experienced, whatever, a way of, like, thinking something along those lines that we can sort of grab onto. And so when you think about sort of, I think this is going to come up later on as well, when we think about sort of like, what civic education potentially should look like, I think one thing is sort of thinking about how can we sort of create moments that make people sort of have, have the kinds of experiences or have the kind of, like, mindset and skill set so that they know sort of like what kinds of sort of like, questions to ask of a scientist, a researcher. Actually, kind of, I will say, just as a slight side note, I think scientists and researcher bring up different thoughts in people's minds, different considerations. I think the term researcher is a little bit broader. And so anyway, I tend to sort of use that instead. But anyway, so I think, like, so I'll just sort of stop there for now. But so I think, to think about sort of perceptions of the audience as affecting reception, as well as sort of the audience's prior experiences.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, that you raised a lot of really good points with credibility and what we see as, competency and credibility, kind of this tied idea. And it reminds me of something that Dr. Jones was mentioning, which was that, it's always changing. We're always re-engaging with the research that we're doing. We're coming at it from new perspectives and it changes over time. It's not stagnant. And I think that, as I've seen with coronavirus and some of the CDC's guidelines, right? At first they're like, masks don't work, masks aren't important, don't worry about masks. And then it was like, oh no, you need a mask for sure, but don't get an N95, you don't need that. And then it was like, well, get an N95 if you can. And so the fact that as we learned more about the virus, our perspectives changed and the advice that we received changed. But I think that also might have created some mistrust of, well, do you really know what's going on if you keep changing your mind all the time? So I was wondering if Dr. Jones or Dr. Levine, if you were comfortable talking a little bit about the juxtaposition of the malleability of research and the fact that it's constantly changing and how that plays a role in the public's perception of research and the results that come out of it. It's the public's trust because of the constant changing nature of research.
Sure. I think that when historian experts disagree in the public square, it is unsettling and even undermining for a broader audience. That for many folks, that's the first time that it's occurred to them that we might disagree, and we might even disagree strongly. An example from recent months is the debate between those who support the, in general terms, the New York Times 1619 project, which has tried to look at and to articulate one version of the origins of the United States, and marking that as a story that begins in the 17th century with the arrival of enslaved Africans in British North America on the one hand, and the 1776 commission out of the White House that marks the beginning of the nation with the Declaration of Independence and the Enlightenment era ideals that were embodied in that document. That is a long-standing interpretive debate among historians that mostly happens not quite behind closed doors, but happens in selective spaces where there aren't a lot of fellow travelers or curious folks present. It happens in professional journals. It happens in professional books. But here, that debate has played out on the public stage, on the national stage, and rather than being understood as a rather ordinary, important and consequential, but still rather ordinary in general terms, part of the way we work and we develop ideas, it is somehow characterized, or comes to be characterized in popular media, as somehow a war, right? There are these, metaphors that posit it as battle, rather than, pointed and strongly held, but really just a scholarly disagreement. So I think that it's an example of how I think one of the longer term fallouts will be this will arrive at the question of how more generally people assess historians and the ideas that they put into the public square. That having been said, I think the other piece of it is that it's very difficult to fully flesh out, scholarly debates in the public square, right? There isn't the bandwidth, there isn't the attention span, there isn't even that deep an interest much of the time, such that everybody wants to take, a deep dive into the literature around what it means to settle on an interpretation of the origins of the United States. In other words, we teach whole courses on that. There are shelves and shelves in the library full of books and more. So, in some ways, our debates become simplified and watered down, and digested in ways that don't really always do justice to the ways in which, to all, right, that undergirds a particular opinion or position. And in my view, the biggest challenge is to speak to those debates, right, for broader audiences on the one hand, and to insist, on the other hand, that how we arrive at those conclusions is rather complex. And I think everybody in any field can imagine, what is it like to explain, in addition to your important scientific conclusions, how the equipment works in your office and how the reagents mix, and that not all of that is suited, right, to a discussion where people are sort of trying to understand the takeaway. And in my field, because history is so much a humanistic endeavor, because it's text-based oftentimes, what it leads to is everybody thinks they're a historian, and maybe everybody is a historian of a sort, and I want to leave room for that. But right now I'm working on a project, as Dr. Levine knows, where tomorrow, where we have been looking at the history of Johns Hopkins University and Mr. Hopkins and slaveholding. And we've really welcomed all sorts of people to sort of come into our research circle and to contribute their insights, their findings, and more. But tomorrow we're hosting a book talk with a historian, in part to introduce the historiography, and that you could look at the documents all day. I guess you could look at the chemical elements all day, but without that deep knowledge, their full meaning, right, their most useful meaning, is never self-evident. And even in historical research, I don't think that conclusions are arrived at because the documents are the texts are self-evident. And so we struggle, I think, with how to make things accessible on the one hand, and on the other hand, how to help people appreciate the complexity that undergirds the kind of conclusions we put out in more popular venues.
I'm going to add a plug for that event tomorrow. So that's part of the Agora Institute Hard Histories project, and it's at noon. And it should be on the Agora Institute website. Yeah, and so I think there's a number of really interesting things I think to say about this. And I'm going to come back to sort of like a similar kind of public conflict, similar to what a different one, but similar to the idea of public conflict within a research community, like what Dr. Jones just mentioned. I think a couple of things. So one is, I in the fall, I taught a class called Science and Democracy. It was an undergraduate class in Krieger, and it was great. And so I'm going to be teaching it again this coming fall for anybody who's thinking about those kinds of topics. And on the very first day, so again, this is like, the beginning of September of 2020, I asked students, I was like, how many of you think that we basically just need to follow the research? We just need to follow the science when it comes to responding to the coronavirus pandemic. And everybody was like, yeah, of course. Like, what else would we do? Like, what kind of stupid question is that? I'm going to go take a different class that's worth my time more. And, I think one of the things that we ended up really unpacking throughout the course of the semester was how, just simply saying, as we often hear in political discourse, especially since last March, but even before then, on various topics, is that simply saying we just need to follow the research is really unsatisfying in many different ways, and is actually misleading in many different ways. And so, one of the reasons is because the research is really uncertain and contested a lot of the times. And that's especially true on a new topic. And sort of what we saw, especially at the beginning of 2020, was sort of this confluence of sort of media that was sort of hungry, and, political leaders and people who sort of, wanted things to be done. Everybody's sort of hungry for answers, and research can't necessarily provide it quite that quickly. And so what you get is basically sort of changes in what we know, and you get some stuff that we think we know that it turns out is wrong, or maybe is fraudulent or whatever, but anyway. And so, but it is this learning process. And if you think about sort of what kind of science and research is, it's a process, it's a collective process of people who are sort of trying to kind of, hopefully sort of, good natured, and trying to sort of, come to sort of a shared understanding of a topic. But it's very much like it is a collective endeavor. So anyway, so this idea that we sort of simply need to follow the science of the research is really sort of limiting as a kind of as a way of thinking, as a style of argument, because the research is often uncertain and contested. And so, the thing that I think we want to know, and, we want to sort of give people practice thinking about, is sort of asking questions about when they are confronted with a claim that says that it is research based, just to dig a little bit deeper and say, who has said it, who agrees with that person, who disagrees with that person, has it been peer reviewed, what does it mean to be peer reviewed, why is that important, basically has the community of sort of research sort of done its thing, and what does that say? So I think that's the uncertain and contested piece. Now, I do think though that like sometimes you can say, and as the coronavirus pandemic has kind of gone on, well, okay, at some point there are things that people really do kind of think that they know. And then of course, other things I should say that, I mean, public health researchers knew things at the beginning of the pandemic from previous pandemics. So, I think it's important to state that as well. But the thing is that like, even when the science and the research aren't contested, we still need to make a distinction between trusting that research and thinking that research should be the basis of policy and practice. And those aren't the same thing. And I think those get conflated a lot. So it's not even just that like, when people say things like, we just need to follow the research, there's often sort of the implicit sort of like the underlying current there is basically that like, and like policy will be sort of like naturally flow from that. Like it will be obvious what the policy solution will be as a result of that. And that's just simply not true. I mean, that just is not true. And that's actually why sort of, a class like, for example, science and democracy is so important, because if we lived in a dictatorship, that could be true, right? Like, and this is sort of, the kind of threat of technocracy and whatnot, is sort of that technocrats are going to sort of rule the world and they're going to sort of make this decision based on whatever. And, I mean, that could be decisions based on the science, but it's also gonna be decisions based on their own sort of positionality and values. Anyway, and so like, we could live in a society like that, but we don't. I mean, if we sort of value sort of small d democracy, right? Like, and small d Democrats rather, as opposed to capital D, the party Democrats. That if we value that, like, then like that policy is going to be a function of sort of not only sort of what the science tells us, but also it is going to be a function of competing interests. It's going to be a function of values. It's going to be a function of risk calculations and so on and so forth. And I think that's been a key source of tension that like, kind of appeals to, well, we just need to follow the research or the science, kind of like papers over in a really unhelpful way, quite frankly. And we're seeing that right now, right? I mean, like, there are many, many ways in which we can interpret sort of how different governors are choosing to reopen their economy and businesses and, have mask mandates, not have mask mandates. There's many different ways of interpreting all of that. But like, and, some people will say it's a bad idea because of the science. And that may be true. But if we want to sort of like understand sort of like, if we want to understand the decisions that they're making, not just simply criticize them, I think we need to sort of take into account the fact that like, what they're saying is, there are competing interests here, or they have different risk calculations, or there's something else, or, whatever. And so I think that's really important. The last thing I would sort of say on this topic right now, and there could be a lot to unpack here as well, is, look, research needs to earn our trust, the collective our, like it needs to be trustworthy. And I think that is also, kind of, and this kind of gets at the thing that one of the things I was saying earlier, that, we can't just sort of like, researchers, scientists, whatever, like, can't just sort of throw out a claim and assume that people are going to like it and agree with it and act on it and pay attention to it because they have fancy credentials after their name. I think that, one of the things that like, I think is really important to keep in mind is sort of that, we have an audience that like, we sort of need to, that we need to demonstrate that we are trustworthy too. And so I think like, one of the examples that, one of the best examples I've seen of this recently is thinking about sort of how to overcome sort of vaccine hesitancy among especially sort of racial minorities in the US. And, there's a lot that could be said about that topic, but like the one thing I want to sort of like kind of pinpoint is sort of, this idea that like, we don't necessarily like just telling people to like to trust the vaccines, even having like, let's say maybe like otherwise sort of credible speakers, like let's say religious leaders or community leaders, or whatever, like telling people who are hesitant to trust vaccines, like, that is sort of at some, like that might work. But like another way to sort of think about that in a way that sort of, I think, respects their like decision-making process, their autonomy, their dignity, like, and all of that, is to say, well, here's why, I think you should find it trustworthy. Here's the process by which these vaccines were developed, right? Here's like, the different stages. Here's like the way in which sort of different kinds of like, regulatory bodies had to assess them. Here is like how the independent scientific advisors were sort of looking at the data in the way that the people who work at Pfizer weren't looking at. Like, here are the different kinds of like institutional processes that were put into place. And I think I think there's something really important about that. Again, from a kind of small d democratic perspective.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great lead-in for my next line of questioning, I guess, which was basically, this idea of whose job it is to provide this trust in research. As Dr. Levine was just discussing, it's on the scientists and researchers to some extent. It's on the public figureheads who, adopt mantles of, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, whatever. It's on them. And so I was wondering, how much does the media, for example, play into this, how the news presents, should the news be presenting opinion pieces like why you should get the vaccine and here's some facts, or, who ultimately does the need for public research or public trust of research rather ultimately fall onto? And if the answer ends up ultimately being the public, what are some skills for someone to develop to move through that confusing, dangerous world?
Well, I guess I would jump in and say, I'm sure there's an argument that says all of the above somehow, right? That you could make a case for, the kind of parties that you've invoked and probably others. But at least for me, I guess I don't know how useful, an approach to the question that actually is, which is to say, I work, in journalism and with journalists. I work with filmmakers. I work with museum curators. Sometimes I am a museum curator. Why do I say that? I say that to say that I have a deep respect for the objectives, the premises, and the approaches of fields that are not mine. In other words, journalism has its own, set of ethics and norms and goals, and not all journalists are monolithic. Not all readers, right? Not all filmmakers. And so I'm somebody, I think, because history is something that is picked up and worked with by folks out of many different kinds of fields beyond historians. I think there are two schools of historians in that regard. There are those of us who regard filmmakers and journalists and more as sort of fellow travelers and storytellers, and try to find a comfortable set of understandings that permit us to coexist, even as we might not always agree. And there are other historians who understand themselves to be the disciplinarians, the gatekeepers, the standard bearers, such that, when that interesting historical documentary, or worse yet, the biopic comes out, there's that other faction within the fields where we kind of pounce and we write these, scathing reviews that hold filmmakers to a standard which I think filmmakers aren't accountable to, and aren't frankly interested in at the end of the day. So I think that, in some ways, I am of the humility school. I was trained by someone who has deeply influenced me, and that he was someone who said, if what you aim to do, right, is to exercise some responsibility over how the public thinks about history, thinks about the work we do. Your job is to do the work and then to go anywhere and everywhere that folks will give you a hearing. And that might be on the op-ed page of a newspaper. It might be, I spent Friday night with K through 12 educators in the state of Oregon who are rethinking their curricula. Next week I'll go over to the Baltimore School of the Arts and talk with sophomores about historical research and their dramatic productions. And that, in other words, my responsibility, in part is to go to where people are and to learn how to speak in more than one language, more than one voice. And in doing that, yes, bring folks the conclusions about what we do, but to the point of trust, I think it's to take the time to, if you will, right, pull back the curtain or lift the hood and let people see, how we do what we do. So, for example, in the Hard Histories project, in this work we're doing about Johns Hopkins, one of our partners is Hopkins Retrospective, and they have put all the primary materials that we're working with, the original research materials, are available sort of in their raw form for folks who, after hearing a reading an op-ed or after hearing a lecture or coming to a book talk, can actually go and think about independently about what they've heard and what we offered up. And those materials are available to journalists, and they're available to filmmakers, and they're, to museum curators and the curious and more. Anybody with a web page can create their own, and I might disagree or not disagree with some of what's produced out of that, but I think that's part of how we engender confidence. I don't like the word trust so much, but I think confidence maybe is the word I would use. Confidence in what we do by being more transparent and going to where people are, meeting them kind of on their own terms, and not sort of remaining, cloistered in the academy, and not only speaking in the highly specialized language that we might use when we're, in a professional setting.
Yeah, I would say that there's a few really interesting kind of like things to add in response to this question. I think about it through I guess I think about it first and foremost through a self-governance lens. And so in order to make self-governance work, what kinds of like skills and mindsets do we need people to have, and how should they approach research-based claims and whatnot? And and I want to say that, like, so everything I just said is at the individual level, and I do not think everything is the responsibility of the individuals at all. And so I'm going to state the individual level stuff first, but then sort of back away from it. And but like I think it's important to sort of think about it is too easy to sort of think about well, yeah, if we think that like what's at stake here sort of with public trust and research is sort of is like broader sort of like decisions about what we should do, right? That kind of broad sort of like kind of core question of, in some ways, of sort of self-governance. What should we do? It's easy to sort of have people kind of like think, well, my answer to that is basically I decide who to vote for and then don't talk to me for the next 4 years or whatever. And I think that I think that's troubling, and that's very limiting. And so we want to sort of think about what are the kinds of I think skills and mindsets that sort of that we might want sort of people to have, and then we can sort of say, okay, who like, how are they going to get them in a way. And so in terms of the kinds of like, skills and mindsets, I think about things like, people should be proficient in, say, evaluating sources of information that they receive on policy related matters, and not just sort of trusting them like whole hog or automatically. They should be looking to have people asking people to explain themselves, asking about sort of counterfactuals. What would an alternative world look like back then? All of this I think is really important, but it's also really it's also really difficult, I think. And so I think that that's like that's why I think like training on this kind of stuff is actually kind of is really, and getting practice with it is really important. The other thing I would say is that we need people who are sort of like willing and comfortable sort of interacting with strangers, because a lot of times the researchers or the scientists who are sort of making claims, they are they are coming from a different community. They're coming from a different sort of social network. They're coming, whatever. And so, and so what we need to sort of think about, and this I think very much, in my mind at least, sort of echoes something that Dr. Jones was talking about a minute ago, of sort of, thinking about sort of how to kind of build those connections, and also sort of encourage both the researchers and the non-researchers to build them, to want to build them, and so on and so forth. I think about sort of from my own sort of personal experience, I run an organization called Research for Impact, and this is an institution that basically is designed to sort of bring researchers and non-researchers, typically community leaders, together. And we sort of, one of the things, I mean, in some ways what we do, I mean, like facts on the ground, so to speak, is like the thing that we're doing is we're doing matchmaking. But like what is kind of taking a step back from that activity, what's happening is sort of, creating an institution and hopefully, over time, helping to sort of bring about a culture change where sort of people from these different communities see the possibility of connecting with the other community as something that they can do, as something that is valuable to them, as something that they should do, as something that's appropriate. I know that, when we first started Research for Impact, many of the questions that sort of came in, this was both from the community leaders as well as from the researchers, was this question about like, well, what is it appropriate to talk about? And what is it appropriate to like reach out about, and so on and so forth. And, and sort of, so, part of like our initial process, and we still very much are doing this, is simply like legitimizing certain forms of interaction that may not be all that common. And I know certainly on the researcher side, even to kind of put it even in slightly even more concrete terms, researchers typically, and again, there's going to be variation on this for sure, but like when they are sort of, first figuring out what their dissertation is going to be about. So, young researchers who are just starting out or whatever, or undergraduate researchers as well, thinking about like what a thesis is going to be about. I think in a lot of times what happens is that, they think about the existing literature and identify a limit of the existing literature and seek to contribute to that existing literature. And so what you get is a potential sort of like advancement in scientific understanding of a topic, which is great. I mean, that is to be celebrated in many different ways. But it is sort of worth noting that, like, to the extent that that's the information that you're taking into account, what isn't being taken into account, or what is potentially sort of being marginalized at those moments, is sort of, consideration about like, what issues are facing communities, right? And like, and you're not necessarily sort of taking that into account when thinking about what research topics are worth investigating. And it is, with research topics, there's an infinite number of possible research topics, right? And so like, you have to, choosing one is sort of, is an art. And so to step back then from the individual level stuff, right? So I think, there's, even everything I just said about some of the mindsets and whatnot, you can even, we can unpack that even further. But then the question is sort of like, how do you sort of bring those about? So Research for Impact is an example of like creating an institution that sort of is trying to sort of like create connections where they don't already exist. but I do think that, like, I think the media can be really important. And I mean, I certainly would not want to minimize the role of media at all. I mean, like, arguably sort of Carl Sagan did more for raising scientific awareness in the 20th century than, like, anything Research for Impact will ever do. Right. But like, but I think that, like, it is sort of, the media is really good at dissemination. But yet, what we want to do, if we think that sort of like, what we need to do is bring about more interaction to bring about the kind of the public trust in research, we think that's important, which I think it is. Then we sort of need to think about sort of, basically kind of how to create those opportunities and those experiences. And, how do we sort of, design civic education programs to do that? How do we provide incentives to do that? But also, how do we make people comfortable? I mean, I think, sometimes in these, what I see in certain kind of conversations around connecting kind of, science and society and whatnot, and is that, like, the affective component can be sort of taken out of the equation, which is the idea, and that, like, people need to be comfortable interacting with strangers on these kinds of topics. And I think that, that's really important, and that sometimes can be missed. And so anyway, so sort of like, I think, in some ways, sort of, there's an all of the above. But the way that I would sort of address this kind of this responsibility question is, at first, to sort of like identify, what do we think people sort of, need to be thinking about, their mindsets, et cetera, and then, like, okay, what kinds of sort of institutions can help them get there?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And then I had one last question, which is kind of prospective, which is, where do we see future issues in research trust or research confidence? Where do we see those issues arising? I think that in the last, last couple of decades, the rise of the internet has made research more accessible than ever, which is also in some way kind of, while lifting one veil has lowered another, which is, this is so inaccessible. I just kind of always assumed I could figure it out if I really wanted to, but now that I really want to and could, I can't. And kind of facing those types of trouble, now that we have, as Dr. Levine was saying, this ability to connect with people and strangers and things like that more than we've ever had before. We have a lot of opportunities to resolve some problems with research trust, but we also have a lot of new problems being presented, and disinformation spread and things like that. So what, in your opinions, in the last couple of minutes here, do you think are the biggest challenges moving forward to address in research trust, or new ones that will arise as we continue?
Should I jump in and let Dr. Levine take us home? I'm going to just make two suggestions, places that my mind goes when I hear your question. The first is that in 2026, we will be marking the United States at 250. And in the build-up to that anniversary, I'm being careful with my words here, but in the build-up to that anniversary, history will be called upon, mobilized, represented, invoked, and a great deal more in order to tell us something not only about what that year means, but who we are, who we've been, who we can and should be. And that is going to be a challenge, I think, for historical researchers and their fellow travelers, because anniversaries like the US at 250, and I'm old enough to remember the US at 200 in 1976, are often necessarily premised in a lot of myths and very little history. So it's sort of framed as a historical anniversary, but in fact, the narratives that go to promoting it and that it encourages are mythical. And historian Rolf Michel Triot, who spent part of his early career here at Johns Hopkins, has a wonderful book called Silencing the Past. And Triot warns historians to stay clear of things like the US at 250, because it's not really intended to teach history at all or to promote historical understanding at all. It is intended to do lots of other things. I don't disagree completely with Triot. I think we have to wade in, and even as messy and as uncomfortable as it is, but it's an example, I think, of where you all will see this conversation, I think, kind of blow up around. And the last thing I'll put on the table is something I've thought a lot less about, but I've learned a lot about in recent weeks, which is about the suppression of knowledge, and including the suppression of historical knowledge. And I'm someone who recently had a book challenged by a public library, and that was a reminder to me that there's another facet to this discussion, right? Which is, again, sort of politics and ideology being brought to bear in a very heavy-handed way. That means that some ideas get the full benefit of air and light and amplification, and other ideas are, as young people say to me, being kept from us. And so that is an old problem, but it is not one that has disappeared. It's one that's gotten even, I think, a new life in recent years. So I'm mindful and keeping my eye out for that as well.
Yeah, so with just a couple of minutes remaining, I guess there's a couple of ways to sort of answer this question. One is to think about, like, sort of, where is research for trust going? How is it going to evolve? The second is sort of think about, like, what kind of broader contextual factors are going to sort of, push that evolution in one way or another. And I think a lot of research that is done in the US, I mean, certainly federally funded research is done at universities, and higher education is increasingly sort of under threat for a variety of reasons, and people sort of are increasingly sort of questioning its value and whatnot, and the finances are shakier and things like that. And that's that's painting with a very broad brushstroke, and it affects certain institutions of higher education more than others and whatnot. But I am papering over that when I make that claim. But I think sort of that's an important sort of contextual feature for sort of thinking about research, where it's done, who's doing it, and so on and so forth. And I think that's going to be something that is like, that is going to be part of the conversation. And because some of that is about sort of like, students sort of, who are attending, but some of it is also very much about sort of like, whether it's about science and technology policy that is influencing budgets and things like that. So I think there's that. I think the other question is sort of, about like, what do we sort of with, what is the trend on trust in research and science in general, right? Overall trust is quite high, and actually has remained high for decades. Where it's not high is when we get certain kinds of matters, like, for example, regulatory types of issues, and that's certainly like so things like environmental issues, public health, like over the past year, some of that kind of stuff is where that's where we sort of see like cause for concern. Potentially, but cause for concern, I mean, even that sort of, we have to sort of, again, kind of echoing sort of something I said earlier, sort of, I think like really what I mean by that is sort of this idea of like, acknowledging the limitations of sort of research, and how, that there are other factors that need to influence sort of how we think about, what to do in response to some of the kinds of challenges that we face. And so anyway, that's, I think, like, there's like a little bit of a few sort of like considerations, but I'm going to stop talking because it looks like we're at the top of the hour.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Levine. Thank you so much to Dr. Jones. We all really appreciate you coming out and speaking to us today and with us. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend. As I said, we will be uploading this to our various social medias. So make sure you can rewatch it if you're interested. And then also hopefully it come out to the talk tomorrow with SNF Agora. That would be fantastic. So with that, I will close this meeting. Thank you so much for coming and have a great day.